Do you ever feel like ear training drills just don't translate to real music? In this episode, I'll show you why most traditional methods fall short, break down the core exercises that can actually improve your musicianship, and I want to share the mindset shift that finally made ear training click for me. So if you stick around, you'll walk away with a practical approach to developing your ear, one that fits how real musicians learn and grow. Welcome to the Join the Hike podcast. Today, I want to pull back the curtain and share something I don't talk about too much: how I actually design ear training lessons, why I believe most traditional approaches just don't work, and what it takes to truly develop your musicianship, no matter where you're starting from. So let's rewind a little bit to my college days. Like many musicians, I was handed a computer program, it was in the computer lab, and I was told to just identify intervals. Get enough right, and you'll pass the assignment. I remember sitting there, had my headphones on, thinking, how does this actually help me recognize intervals in real music with these poor quality sounds? Looking back, it felt like a box just to check off for a grade. It was well intentioned, maybe, but not meaningful. It didn't give real results. And for a long time after that, I was stuck. I kept asking myself, what's the point of ear training if the drills don't lead to anything musical? It's a huge issue, I think, in ear training. We train, but is it actually going to lead to something musical? So I started searching for deeper principles, something that would connect ear training to the actual art of making music. I wanted more than just a training system. I wanted a path, like a philosophy, not just a set of exercises. And I looked to mentors, hoping some could show me the way. But the truth is, nobody can hand you the path. You do kind of have to find it for yourself. Eventually, I remember this very clearly, I stumbled across David Lucas Burge's ear training course. At that time, it was really a revelation. Here, there was finally a path. But as I worked through it, I started to realize I was still missing something. The drills didn't always cohere for me. And I found myself staring kind of up at a cliff. I was unsure how to climb it. The advice was always just keep practicing. But what if that wasn't enough? You know, what if I needed a different approach? What if I needed a more step by step approach? And it was a great starting point for me because I really used it as a scaffold that allowed me to say, oh, okay, this is what we need to do to train the ear. It does take practice, it does take work. But at some point, I just decided I had to stop worrying about passing every drill. I told myself basically, screw it. I'm going to do one lesson every day, no matter what. If it was easy, great. If it was hard, well, I'd spend a week on it. Sometimes I spent up to a month on some of those drills. And what I discovered was surprising. Even when I couldn't finish a drill perfectly, my ear was still improving. So it wasn't about mastering each exercise. It was about showing up every day and stretching my ear. And that was a really important lesson for me to learn, that you just have to show up every single day. Take a day off every now and then, not going to hurt you. But mostly, you really do need to show up at least 5 times a week. And I actually even found some benefit to just going 6. I think a day off is actually helpful. So over time, just talk a little bit about my teaching philosophy. I realized that some exercises were far more beneficial than others. But to really grow, I needed to work on a full range of skills, not just obsess over one thing. So I'm a big proponent of the idea that skills learned in isolation don't translate to real world musicianship. The key was variety, context, and constant, gentle challenge, not perfection. And this is the thing that I think a lot of the drills and most programs will do is they say you have to go for perfection. You have to get a certain score. But it's not about that. The way you really develop your ear is showing up every day and working. I mean, think about it. You play an instrument, ideally. Do you get better by coming in and doing the same thing every day perfectly? Or does it start with a few mistakes? And then As you learn new music, that older music becomes easier. It's cumulative. It's not just that if I learn this skill, I'll be able to do this thing. You need to learn it in many different contexts. You can learn to play major scales up and down the piano, but does that mean you can play a Beethoven sonata? No, it's a different skill. You have to be able to practice it in multiple different ways, and you gradually get better with each piece that you actually perform. So when I was designing my own curriculum, which I've been doing, I guess, since high school, but I really got serious about it in college. But take my flawless ear training course as an example. I focus on exercises that require attention and push you gently to improve. For example, the more you listen to the note C, the more you start to recognize its unique character, not just in isolation, but in relationship to other notes and in different musical contexts. And I'm not talking about perfect pitch here. I did a 30-day challenge where I tried to develop perfect pitch. You can watch that here. It ended the way I thought it would. And maybe you can say that part of that is a self-fulfilling prophecy because I felt like it wouldn't work, and that's what happened. But it did confirm that there are definitely differences we can hear between various pitches. So again, I'm not talking about perfect pitch, but I'm talking about developing a real practical ear for music. And by listening to these notes in isolation like this, we are building a different type of hearing. It's not perfect pitch hearing, although you may develop perfect pitch. It's more than that. It's this holistic way of listening to music where it's not just individual intervals like Mary Had a Little Lamb, or, Here Comes the Bride, or the Star Wars theme to identify a perfect fifth. It's not just things like that. It's more holistic. It's about actually just hearing sound for sound. The way you can hear a perfect fifth, a perfect fourth without referencing any outside tune is that you practice it and you view it from multiple angles until you just learn to recognize it like you recognize your best friend. You're never going to confuse your best friend for someone else, So when I build a course, I really think about both the hobbyist and the advanced musician at the same time. I explain concepts in a clear, general language whenever I can. As we get into the more advanced courses like Counterpoint, Form and Analysis, okay, we're starting to build our jargon so we can start to use some jargon. But in the beginning, I try not to do that because I want these courses to be applicable to everyone. So there's no jargon that locks out beginners as much as I can. But there also has to be enough substance for the advanced students to keep growing. So for my more advanced courses like the Composing Hour, I raise the bar a little bit. You need to read music well, and it really helps to be able to play an instrument. But the underlying principle is always the same: attention, context, and a holistic approach. And I would say part of this comes from the fact that I do have ADHD. I've been diagnosed with it multiple times in my life. And I know what it's like to be sitting here listening to somebody talk and then all of a sudden realize you just cut out and you missed something important. And so you develop these cues, you develop these responses to be able to deal with that, where you maybe can repeat the last few words that they said as a question, and then you can get context, and you get really good at figuring out context when you have ADD, because you start, you don't want to always say, well, I wasn't paying attention. People won't understand. They'll just think it's rude. So you have to develop all these coping mechanisms to allow you to get better at understanding context and then eventually get better at paying attention. At this point, I don't even know if I have ADD anymore. It's almost like I've cured it through all the intense work that I've done, but I do see it crop up every now and then. Like right now, when I'm talking about ADD, when I'm trying to talk about my teaching philosophy, although it's related. Okay. So really getting back on track, when I realized that context could actually change how students perceived intervals, it did make me realize we had to go back to basics. If students can't break apart chords and intervals and even hear the differences between a chord and an interval, one of the greatest challenges for entry-level people in my Flawless course, just go take it. The first couple lessons are free. You'll see what I mean. When you get to chord or interval, you're going to be like, I can't hear the difference. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't. But sometimes you'll just be like, I don't know, And what that indicates is that you're actually not ready for more advanced work. So any advanced work we put on top of that, would just create gaps in knowledge. So if you don't have some of these fundamental skills, you're going to have gaps in knowledge. And eventually we have to go back and fill those in. Otherwise, everything you built on top of that is flimsy and it's not solid. So this kind of understanding really influenced my broader teaching philosophy. I needed to make things step by step and really cover these fundamental issues. Most students can play their instrument, but they don't understand how music is put together. Without that, no matter how good you are at your instrument, you're going to be less effective as a musician. And this is really where I think audiation comes into play. And one of the things that makes what I do so unique is that we focus on hearing things internally, because when you can hear things internally, that's when you're truly starting to absorb, internalize, and learn music. So let's talk a little bit about some breakthrough exercises. One of my favorite lessons is to show students how the overtone series works. There's a video on here where I demonstrate it. I'll silently hold down a few notes that fit the series. And when I say on here, I mean on YouTube. So once I play down a few notes that fit the series, I'll silently hold them. I won't allow them to make any sound. You just depress them very gently. And then I'll play the fundamental loudly. So the fundamental is going to be the tone that's underneath them that will resonate with these tones from the overtone series. More complex idea, but the effect is that these silent notes that I'm holding down quietly, they will ring out softly. And students can hear it. They can hear the chord that I'm holding down. If I'm holding down C, E, and G, those all are fairly close to the fundamental. They will have sympathetic vibrations and they will ring out. If I move the upper notes to tones that are not part of the sort of immediate overtone series, the piano may resonate a little bit, but doesn't resonate as well. This is something that I found typically gets students interested in. And, I wouldn't necessarily say hooked, but you've got their attention for long enough to see if the next thing you provide is even better, and it shows that there are mysteries waiting to unlock within the course of your training. It's also a great icebreaker. You're starting with a new class, nobody knows you. They're sitting here like this saying, I dare you to teach me something. I saw that over and over again. At first it was intimidating, then after a while I was like, yeah, I'm going to teach you something. I know I've done this before. But it's a good way to kind of get them to buy in quickly. And if you're going to teach your training, you need to get people to buy in that you're the person to teach it. It's really important. So that's one of my favorite drills to use. And another exercise that surprised me was when I'd play chords. Some students could hear the top or bottom note, but few could hear the middle. Then I tried playing a major chord followed by a fifth. The major chord, and when I say fifth, I don't mean major fifth. There's no such thing as a major fifth. It's a perfect fifth, right? Just an interval, 5 steps away from each other, like C to G on the piano. So the major chord played first made them perceive the fifth as major. Okay, do you understand that? So if I play the major chord first and then I play a fifth, they'll perceive that fifth to be a major chord. If I played a minor chord followed by a fifth with a significant break even, students would then hear the fifth as a minor chord and not necessarily a fifth. So I discovered that if I could get them to hear a fifth as a fifth and a chord as a chord, they would dramatically improve their ears. This is where one of my early exercises in the Flawless course, quarter interval, found its inception. So the idea here is that this happens in music too. I once had a question on YouTube and somebody was like, well, you can't leave out the third. Well, yeah, you can. And composers do it all the time. So the backstory on that is that when you're learning music theory, if you're building a triad, root, third, fifth, C, E, G, that would spell a major triad. Well, there's some chord tones you can leave out, namely the fifth. You can leave the fifth out and you still have the root and the quality. So we still essentially know that is implying a major chord, even though the G isn't being played. So, the guideline in music theory is to never leave out the third. But this doesn't apply when the chord has already been established at the beginning of the measure. And composers do this all the time. They'll play a chord, C, E, G. We have the tonality in our head. We know it's a major chord. And then they can get away with not having the third. They play the fifth, and it just gives a slightly lighter, like bouncy texture for the chord. You know, it's still a major chord because that third is still in our ear, but we don't have to play the full chord. We relax the density a little bit. We're not dealing with any parallel fifths or octaves. There's nothing really wrong with it. It just gives us a softer decay on that major chord. And it can be really influential if you're trying to go like bum, 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 you know, and you're having this one chord on top just repeat over and over again. Well, you don't necessarily want to pound out the major chord every time. You can go major chord, fifth, major chord, fifth. It's a really cool effect. Should try it. Maybe I'll try it. So like this. So that fifth we can tell is being texturally different. Now what if I make a minor? It's still minor. It feels minor. So it's a cool little technique. So this is one of my early exercises really came from, because I started to realize people will hear a fifth as a major chord unless they've been trained by comparing the major chord and the fifth right next to each other. So here's a good example. Most students think they can hear the difference between major and minor very clearly. I'll play a major chord. I'll have them identify it. Then play a minor chord. Pretty easy, right? But what happens if I start playing a whole bunch of major and minor chords in succession? They lose it. They really do start to lose the ability to differentiate. There's a critical aspect of ear training. You have to be able to hear major and minor quickly shifting in context. Once they realize they don't know major and minor as well as they thought, they start to buy into the process. So I find that a lot of times what you can do, and I guess I'm talking to teachers right now, and for students who are interested in why my method's different, if you can show students their weaknesses and then demonstrate that if you follow a certain process, those weaknesses can be lessened and even removed, then they really do start to buy into the process. So it's this basic idea where if you can't tell what quality a chord is as you're listening to a musical work, your ear isn't picking up on the subtle nuances you need to be a better musician. And this is a simple challenge. It reveals weaknesses and shows students why they actually need ear training in the first place. I swear I just need to do a video that says why you need ear training and show you all the things that are illusions in music because they're deceptive. They feel like something else until you can hear past the illusions, until you develop your ear in kind of a focused way where it can start to hear both the individual elements in music and the context, you know? So we will need to be able to hear things in context. And so as far as motivating students goes, you know, I keep working on fundamentals while constantly adding other exercises that push and challenge them. They may not realize how the simpler challenges are developing their ear, but the more complex challenges that we have that are manageable, the more motivation stays high. It's these simple challenges that really build. So you don't need to go overly complex. In fact, if you go too complex, students don't learn. And this is one of my issues with it. It's not the college fault. It's not the university fault. It's just the way the programs are created. It's the system that we have in place. You have one semester to teach these skills. We can only make students take so many semesters of music theory. You know, they have to be able to graduate. So they get 2 years of music theory and ear training, typically in a usual program. And there's so much that you need to learn that really a lot of those programs, what they're doing is they're weeding out the students that don't have the fundamental skills to begin with, because it moves at such a fast pace and we almost panic as professors, you know? I mean, I never did. No, just kidding. No, but you know, we kind of panic. We're like, okay, I got to teach all this stuff. I got to teach all this stuff because second semester, I don't know if they're going to have me. They might have someone else. I got to make sure they're ready. I can't send a student that's not ready onto this other professor. You know, you get worried about it and you really want to make sure that they have this foundation. And you panic, I think, and you throw everything at them. Not just because the instructor decides to do that. The professor may not have a say in it. The professor may be told, make sure you teach this by week 3, this by week 5. This is a good midterm. This is what they need by the final. And it's so overwhelming and so much information. What we do is we go high complexity and we just see how many students can do it. When a more effective route would be to just calm down, take it slow, and go with really simple foundational exercises that build up the ear so that it's ready to absorb everything else. And it's my belief that you can actually do a 2-year program where, and I'd love to do this somewhere, but you do a 2-year program where you go slow, you don't overwhelm, and you have step by step, day by day drills that gradually build. The problem is you really have to think ahead, which is what I've done with the Flawless course. I have 250 lessons, give or take, which is equivalent to a 2-year program. So 250, you're thinking, well, that's a year. Well, it is, but in a college program, you're meeting 14 to 16 weeks when you take out finals and midterms each semester. So you're getting 28 weeks over the year, maybe, of actual instruction time. So that's what I'm really basing it off of, and 2 years of that. So yeah, theoretically, you could go through the Flawless course in less than a year if you just went lesson by lesson. But I think taking a little more time with it is a good idea. But that's one of the things that I would really like to do is develop this for a college curriculum. And guess what? That's what the Flawless course ended up being, except I made it even more amenable to people with less experience. You need some experience in music. You really do know how, you need to know how to read notes on the staff. That's why I created the Staff Speaks series, but that's kind of my entry level course to get you to be able to start Flawless. And it's 90 days and you can start Flawless. And, I've worked with a huge number of students from all walks of life, hobbyists, professionals, professors, university level musicians. I've trained in the last 2 years probably 5 professors who are teaching various subjects. I'm not going to mention names, of course, but they come because they want to know more. They want to know more than just being able to go in and teach kind of the standard. So they come to me to learn more advanced techniques. And it's easy in a university setting. Students think a skill is easy, but then they see the instructor do something subtle. They do something subtle, which makes them question what's possible. So I'm going to try and explain this. When I did this multiple times, but I'm going to talk about one particular example. And I'm not trying to brag or do anything like that. I'm just saying this is the kind of thing that you should be able to do as a musician when you've trained yourself to view music from multiple different angles. And it's practical. It's practical. So when I was performing a counterpoint that I created in class, we did it together as a class, I had projected on the board behind me. So we had these projectors. I was sitting at the piano. Board was behind me. If you've seen any of my live videos, you'll actually see that I've got the piano and the board's behind me. So I could see a faint mirrored reflection in the piano stand on the front of the piano. And I'd play from that reflection. And students would notice and wonder, how is that even possible? Because I'm reading a reflection, it's reversed and it's muddied and it's on the piano, And my point in telling you this is that you kind of have to be able to demonstrate greater skills than what you're teaching, but not in a way that's in their face or makes them feel inferior. I really think that's important. I try to give them a taste of where they can go. And that was something I just did because I needed to play the counterpoint on the screen, but I couldn't do it like this, And so it was actually easier for me to just look at the reflection, invert it in my mind, and play it for them. But when I realized that actually motivated students, that kind of surprised me. Teaching with a live audience, you can't replace that. You've got all these people that are making these courses on music theory and ear training. But if they've never taught a class of 75 people, I question how they can really anticipate the kinds of problems that are going to come up. And also the kinds of things that motivate students. And that is one of the things that surprisingly was like, okay, this is something I need to demonstrate that they can do because they just don't believe that they can do this. So finding things that motivate students is a very large part of being a teacher. And I try and do that in everything that I create. Now we're getting into audiation and ear training. So, audiation is simply the ability to hear music in your head. You're not just recalling, you know, but you're creating something new. I'm not just listening to a melody and then repeating it. That's kind of an entry level introduction to audiation, but there's a subtle distinction here. You're not just recalling, you're creating something new. So, audiation is more difficult than just replaying what you've heard. Now, I've had people say, you made this term up. Okay. I didn't. The term was coined by Dr. Edwin Gordon in the 1980s, and his curriculum was geared towards children. I take it to a different level. I teach adults how to hear one, two, three, four, and eventually entire works in their mind. It's not easy. It takes time and dedication. But for the committed student, it develops what seems like a supernatural ability. I mean, if we're being honest, Beethoven could write a symphony in his head. Okay. And, we always hear these stories about how he would listen to music, but he could audiate very well. And you can too, if you put in the effort. I've been told, I haven't been able to verify this, but I've been told by somebody who is a distinguished professor, has entries in the Harvard Dictionary of Music. I mean, serious person here, that Mozart could audiate, but had trouble hearing counterpoint. Now, I'm sure that's some writing somewhere that I just haven't come across, so I'm taking this person's word for it right now. His name's Virko Bali. He's a Ukrainian American composer, and he's done quite a bit. He's the most underrated name in music, I think, today. But the point is, you can learn to audiate. And for me, it really clicked one day when I was waiting for a class and suddenly heard a wind symphony performing a piece of mine. I've told this story many, many times because it was such a important turning point in my thinking. I thought it was coming from another room, but it was in my head. That experience showed me how powerful audiation can be and that it's something you truly can develop. So if you can replicate the sound of someone's voice, or if you can hear someone speaking as you read their email, you already have a strong ability to audiate. So when I read an email, I actually never hear it in my voice. If it's not a person I know, I don't even know what the voice is. It's just some random voice. But if I know the person, I will actually read it in their voice. That is an indication that you probably have some ability to hear in detail music, like hearing a violin versus a piano. But it's just something that needs to be developed. I didn't always have this ability. One of the first exercises I recommend that you start with is a drone. So pick a comfortable note and just let it ring out in your mind. A comfortable note, one that seems comforting to you. Try to get it clear and clear. Match it to a specific instrument timbre. That's Timbre. I see this spelled wrong a lot. It's Timbre. It is the color of the instrument. Think of it that way. And once you have that clear drone in a specific timbre, add another tone above it. Maybe a perfect fifth, maybe something else. If you're having trouble hearing two tones, try and just hear rhythm at first. It's sometimes easier to hear rhythm against a drone. The goal is to start to hear two things. If you can hear two things, then gradually those two things can become more discrete things, like two tones. Rhythm is somewhat ambiguous, rhythm instruments. The drum, it doesn't really have a specific pitch. It's multiple pitches. It's a noise, is what we call it. So sorry for all the drummers out there. Don't think you're just noise. You're the backbone of music. So I have a lot of respect for percussionists. But just try and hear anything above it while holding on to that drone. That's how the process starts. And this is how I started. I remember walking around campus and I was hearing a single drone. And at first I tried and hear particular intervals, but I wasn't great at that. So I said, you know what? I'm just going to hear anything at all. And over time, I got better at it. And this is how the process starts. We build and we build and we build from there. We increase memory and listening for errors in melodies. This is a fun thing to do. You play a melody, then play it again with an error and ask, where's the error? This is something that I'll do in the composing hour and in the flawless course. So these exercises really build the ear and memory, and research suggests that they deepen audiation as well. So audiation and ear training, they go hand in hand. Both are necessary for true musicianship. In my courses, I integrate both. A typical lesson might start with technical drills, identifying intervals, chords, or rhythms, then move into creative exercises, auditing a melody, composing a short phrase in your head, or singing back something you've never heard before. I help students connect what they're hearing in their mind to what they're playing or writing. So the skills, they end up reinforcing each other. So I want to bust a myth here, okay? We often think that perfect pitch is kind of a golden ticket to musicianship. It's not. It's a great ability, but it doesn't mean you can compose internally or match pitch with an orchestra or have a robotic ear. It's not perfect. In fact, perfect pitch students, I know from experience, can struggle with transposing, tuning, and ensemble playing. Relative pitch, which is what most of us have to some degree, can be faster and more effective if trained well. I just want to emphasize that perfect pitch is a spectrum, and it can help or hinder depending on your training and temperament. And I don't want to get into this too much because everybody has their own super specific ideas about what perfect pitch is and what relative pitch is. I don't care about any of that. Can you hear the music that you're playing? Can you hear the music that somebody else plays? Do you know what that music consists of? The intervals, the chords, the textures, the dynamics. Can you describe it using the language of music notation? If you can, that's all I care about. And more importantly, audiation, ear training, and musical memory, and definitely imagination are going to be far more important than any specific perfect pitch versus relative pitch. Let's not try and get into camps here. I don't think perfect pitch is necessary. And for that reason, I'll say I don't know if it's worth your time to develop it. Because for the amount of time you spend developing perfect pitch, you could be developing some really profound skills in the relative pitch spectrum. And I don't know that it matters that you can tell the difference between an A and an A flat. I think it'd be much better if you could hear 8 notes at once and be able to isolate them and know their interval relationships and pick out that chord, and notate it. Because that's something that just because you have perfect pitch, it doesn't mean that you can hear a 3, typically 3, but a 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 note chord. And that's something that still has to be developed. So whether you have perfect pitch or not, you still have work to do. And that's what I'm getting at here. All right, let's talk a little bit about a personal journey. I've tried all kinds of creative exercises with students. Once, when students struggled with sight singing advanced music, I told them to sing the half steps instead of using solfege or interval names. I got in a little bit of trouble for this because, we have to teach a very particular way, but hey, it was an advanced class. They were doing really well. It was one of my better classes that I'd ever had. And so I said, I'm going to try this out and see if it fixes these issues. And so the idea here is if you have a perfect fifth, sing 7, because a perfect fifth has 7 half steps. A perfect fourth, you'd sing 5. And it goes like this, major third is going to be 4, minor third is 3. It was hard, even for me, because I made this up on the spot and I just said just wanted to see if it would work. But it forced everyone to think about the intervals they were singing. Really think about them. Because if you suddenly say 1, 1, 1 and you're singing half steps, it suddenly starts to sound different than a 2. And it goes back to this idea, the apple. We want to look at it from all these different angles, top, bottom, side, cut it open, see what's on the inside, So we have to look at things from different angles. So this is just one more way of looking at things from a different angle. And it forced everyone, like I said, to focus on the intervals they were singing, not just tonal centers. So students end up singing more in tune and with greater awareness, but it was difficult. And when I shared this with a colleague, I was told I really couldn't make it a focus. This was the first time I realized I wouldn't be able to innovate within the university system. And it has nothing to do with the individual who I talked to this about. But in the university system, and I understand it and it makes sense, you absolutely have to follow certain procedures and set standards when it comes to teaching ear training. So if I taught this technique and then they went and took second semester theory from another professor who didn't know that technique, had never been introduced to it, all of a sudden the students are going to be confused. So it's 100% right. The colleague was 100% right that you have to be careful with stuff like that. And you can use it. I was told I could use it, but I just had to make it very clear that is not what we teach and is not what they'll be graded on going forward. So I did use it occasionally because it just helps so much with intonation, but I would keep it to maybe 5 minutes of a class session once a week just to help with intonation a little bit because it really did help. But it did teach me that innovating within the university system is possible. And I mean, that's what it's for. It's higher education. You're supposed to be able to innovate, but it would take a very long time to be able to do that. And I basically have to do the research completely on my own and get it accepted, and then get it accepted by accreditation authorities. There's all these things I would have had to do, but it kind of marked the beginning of the end for me personally there, because that was the first time I realized I can't do the research I want to do. And, it's just one of those things. And so when I found out that I wasn't going to be teaching at the university anymore, that was kind of a terrifying moment. And it wasn't terrifying for too long though. And that's how I know I'm going on the right path. But my stomach kind of dropped. I thought, okay, what am I going to do? I have so much going on right now. And I just knew that even though I was given an option to reapply and to take a part-time position, I just knew that staying wasn't going to lead to a good career. So despite the fear and my desire to keep working with students, I knew I had to leave. So I actually got the email on my birthday saying that essentially all instructors, it wasn't just me, all instructors have to reapply. And the idea was that we needed to make sure that everybody was on the same level. And I respected it, but I just knew that I wasn't going to do that. I did everything honorably though. I helped transition, shared my materials, made sure exams ran, but I was excited despite the fear about creating something uniquely my own. And with a wife and a 1-year-old at the time, it was frightening, but I figured it was better to pull the Band-Aid off now. And I was starting to reach a point where, I really did respect everybody I worked with. I love the university, I love the students, but I reached a point where I just had to take that risk. And everything about what I'm doing is tough. I'm telling you this so that you know that you're not alone if you're dealing with something difficult. I had doubt about my decision, worry about paying bills, the feeling that the longer I was out of the university, the harder it would be to get back in. It's really not for the faint of heart. I meditate, and that actually helps. But I ignore the doubts and just push through, because every moment you spend focusing on the doubts is time you could be working on a solution. And I have a goal to complete these courses, and once I do, they're there. They're part of my legacy. All these courses I'm working on, flawless ear training, audiation, counterpoint, format analysis. Some of them are done. Audiation's complete. Composing hour is a new thing I'm doing. So I'm doing all these different things and I'm going to finish them because I feel like I have something to offer or and I want to get it out there. Or maybe AI will scrape it all and it'll mean nothing. Who knows? So that's always a possibility. So I'm trying to do this just so you know. I mean, this doesn't sound that bad, but I mean, I've gone through a lot of things in my life. When I was in my graduate program, I remember looking for quarters in a parking lot so I could go buy water because the place I was staying at the moment wasn't the cleanest water. It was kind of had a weird smell and a tint to it. And so I am no stranger to pushing through things, but at the same time, I did have a lot of support. I had a great family, still do, and I have people that would help me. I guess maybe I was just too proud to ask for help in a lot of cases. And, they did help me out with a lot of things. So I have that. Just saying, if you're struggling, the only way out of it is to keep going, you know? So talk about a typical day because it's something that people have asked me. A typical day for me has to start early. I try to wake up at 4:30. Today, I woke up at 2. No, it was 3. And I'm usually asleep by midnight or earlier if I can. It's like last night I went to bed at 10. So I slept about 5 hours. Pretty good for me. And I'm doing this right now because I'm in a production and growth phase. So I'm willing to work hard during course creation. And I say the same thing to you. If you're trying to develop your ear, you're in a growth phase. You have to work hard for 2 or 3 years, develop that ear, and it'll change your life as a musician. But you got to be consistent. It's so horrible when I see people, they're making progress, making progress. They'll go 2 weeks in a row, come in and practice every day. Then they'll take a day off. And then that day turns into 3 or 4, turns into a few weeks, like, okay, I'm just going to start back at the beginning again. What if you just kept going? What if no matter what, you made time for 30 minutes to work on your skills? Where would you be in 2 years? And so that's kind of my philosophy. And this is why I wake up early. And I also wake up early because I do have a 2-year-old now. She's now 2. And I like to watch her in the morning. And then I work in the afternoon. I'll put her to sleep when I can. And then I'll play with her at night. And so I can't help out if I'm working all day long. So I wake up really early because that's the best time for me to get work done. Nobody bothers me. I can record. It's quiet. And then I can be present the rest of the day. And then I just have to go to bed a little bit early, earlier than I'd like because I really am a night owl. But you do what you have to do, right? And so I kind of work until the day is done, usually around 6, but sometimes later. I'm trying to add exercise back in. I've been pretty good with that. I figure, hey, you know what? You're telling everybody to be disciplined, but you're not even running anymore. Running is something that I used to love to do. So I'm adding exercise back in, even if it's just a run or strength training on the weekends. Sometimes I'll lift weights while a video processes. Like once I finish this video, I got to let it go for like 2 or 3 hours while it just processes in the background. And then I'll have to upload it. I don't have to wait there while it's uploading or processing, but it's time you really can't use a computer. So as musicians and business owners, we struggle so much. I'm talking about everything today, apparently, but I understand why musicians struggle to commit to ear training, but it just saves you time in the long run. Okay. So if you develop a good ear, everything else becomes faster and more efficient. And that's really what I'm getting at here. I told you all these different stories. I told you about like the fear. Okay. I was offered the opportunity to stay at the university. I just had to reapply. And I was encouraged to go through the process. Nobody was kicking me out. But I was getting kicked out of the position I had for 2 years, which was a full assistant professor position. But my position was a visiting assistant. So it's in the name. It's going to end one day. And so, I really love everything I learned, but I figured, you know what? I got to the point where I always wanted to be a university professor. In college, that was a goal. I didn't think I'd be able to attain it, but that was what I wanted to do. And I did it for 8 years. And it was some of the greatest experience of my life, but I kind of think the universe sometimes kicks you out. You know, it forces you to move when you don't want to. I always joke that when God opens a door or closes a door, he pushes you out a window. Because that's kind of what it feels like when a door closes. You're getting pushed out a window, and I don't know, maybe you're hopefully on the ground floor, maybe it's second or third floor, and we'll see if you live, but it can be traumatic. And so I'm just telling you some of this because I think it's important. It's important to know that no life is perfect. You know, what you see on social media and all that. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, and we all have our own challenges to deal with. Some relative to ours are much worse. And I think that that's one of the things that maybe I've been able to hold on to is that comparatively speaking, I'm still eating. I still have a place to live, you know. It could be worse. And there's plenty of people out there that do have it worse. So you just got to put it in context. But I think it's helpful to know that if you take risks sometimes, there can be a payout. But it's not just the risk. See, you take the risk and that's an action. And then you can't come back from it. But if you take that risk and then you dive into despair, everything will fall apart. You then have to put in significant effort. I mean, I sleep as little as possible, but I make sure I get enough sleep. And you just have to do what it takes. So I hope that was a little motivational for you. That's just my own experience. I'm sure everybody has their own. And, you know, feel free to share in the comments what you're dealing with. So let's talk about growth and mastery. You know, inspiration can come from anywhere. I lived in Japan for about 2 years and was a serious runner. I was running between cities, half marathons, even a marathon, at least once a month. You know, one day while running, I heard all these noises. They were coming from either side. And I thought it'd be cool to write a piece using surround sound, you know, surround sound, right? All around. And the idea was a melody swirling around you instead of just coming from one direction. I wrote about this in my composition book, Elements of Music Composition, I believe, but I never wrote that piece. Yeah, so lately I've been composing more and moving toward experimental works. And I got a new musical idea. I would usually let it simmer. If it sticks around, this is kind of my philosophy. So if I get an idea, I let it sit. If it sticks around for more than a few days, I assume it's good enough to compose. So my joke is I haven't written anything in 10 years. So and that's not true. But if I have a deadline, I'll focus on the main melodic ideas, record them by singing, sleep on it, and then compose and audiate the rest. Sometimes, like with this piece I wrote, the hornet's nest, it's a play on words. So it's like a hornet, you know, that thing that scares us to death, but it's also a little horn, a hornet. So I wrote this little piece. It was a fun piece for two of my good friends in the brass band at the time. And it's a brass band piece. You know, it's available here on YouTube. You can listen to it and you actually see them performing. And I did the entire process in a single day. So with that piece, I had to, you know, because we need to get something quick, simple, ready for performance. And I knew I'd only have like one or two rehearsals at most. And so I just had to get it done because our rehearsal was Thursday. I think I wrote it Tuesday, edited Wednesday, printed on Thursday, something like that. But it was like 2 days of work. So if a lesson idea resonates with a student, I'll do the same thing there. I'll refine and publish it. So my process is really to get an idea, let it marinate, see if it sticks. And when it's fully formed, that's when I put it out into the world. I refine it and then I publish it. So, of course, not everything works out. When I first started teaching at the university, I did have trouble articulating my ideas. So one day I wrote everything down I wanted to say and I read it in class. I didn't make it very far, you know, but I was thinking it would help immediately. I mean, I think I read a sentence. I realized this wasn't working. It was fake. It was not authentic. It's not why the students were there. And why would students come to see me read a script, you know? So I tossed it. I explained to the students what I was trying. and I taught the class from my own knowledge. Later, I started to use PowerPoints as an aid, but eventually I stopped using those for anything but musical examples. My failures really made me trust myself, and they pushed me to study and research more and helped me become a better professor. So, if I could go back in time, I'd tell my younger self to take ear training and music theory more seriously. You know, training the fundamentals the right way doesn't make you rigid, but it does make you more creative and adept at working within and around music. I don't regret any path that I've taken, though. Every struggle gave me experiences that I honestly would not trade for anything. So today's podcast was about sharing experiences. Now, the reason I did that was because I wanted to offer you some insight into how I've created these courses, how I approach things, so that you'd have a better understanding of how all this works, and also to somewhat motivate you and to let you know that things are hard. You just have to push through them. That is how you overcome. I forgot I had one more thing to say. I have one more bullet point here. So, talking about inspiration and action, I'm sharing these insights because a lot of people believe I just naturally have a good ear or understand theory. It's not true. I've had students tell me they just can't do theory or their ears are broken, but I have been there. The only difference between someone who developed a good ear and someone who didn't is that the person who developed the good ear and didn't have a naturally good one worked consistently. Some people are going to be born with a natural ear, but that alone doesn't make a musician. You got to have consistency, curiosity, and really a willingness to keep showing up. That's what matters most. I was recently asked by a fellow professor, what do you think the role of music theory is? It's not about prioritizing Western music theory over Eastern or any other tradition. Learning music theory is about learning a kind of logic, a way of understanding how music works. Now, the more systems you study, the more you realize every tradition has its own logic, beauty, and way of making sense of sound. And whether your roots are in Western symphonies, Indian ragas, Japanese folk songs, or any other tradition, the magic comes from going deep, understanding the logic, the history, and the expressive power of the music that you love. So, in our quest to be kind of well rounded, we sometimes skim the surface of everything and we master nothing. For real musicianship, mastery is more important than content. If you want to study Eastern music, master its principles. If you're drawn to Western theory, dive deep. That's where I can help you. I can't help you with these other styles because I'm not an expert. I'm only an expert in Western music theory, you know? But don't worry about which system is better. There's no hierarchy in music, just different paths, and each one has its own rewards. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by all there is to learn, there's ear training, theory, practice, creativity. Just start small. This week, carve out 5 minutes a day to listen deeply to a piece of music you love. Just 5 minutes of it. Try to hear it in your mind, replay it, sing it back, or just notice something new. Consistency is way more important than intensity. Mastery isn't about being perfect, it's about being present, curious, and willing to keep going. And if there's one thing I hope you take from my journey, the whole reason I did this is because I'm trying to show you a more three-dimensional view of myself. I'm letting you in a little bit, but what I want you to take from this is this. You don't have to be born with a gift. You just have to be willing to work hard and harder than anyone else. You may have to struggle, and you need to find a way to find joy in whatever process you think is mundane. I had somebody say, second unit of my ear training course, put them to sleep. Wrong attitude, Maybe take another ear training course that works for you because it's obviously not right. But if that's the attitude that the hard things are boring, you need to try and find a way to reframe that because that's how you're going to succeed. And whether you're just starting out or you've been at this for years, You can grow, you can learn, and you can make music that's uniquely yours. So that's all. Thank you for listening and keep making music from the inside out. See what I did there? All right, I'll see you next time.